Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the University of New South Wales and our Forum on Clean Energy Finance and Investment, which is jointly hosted by the University of New South Wales and also the US Consulate-General here in Sydney. More on that in a minute. I'm Iain MacGill, and I'm one of two joint directors. You'll meet the other joint director, Maria Bullett, later in the morning, of the University Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets. And we're just one of the groups at this university working in this space of clean energy. Well, it's certainly interesting. I think we can all agree it's important, probably concerning, but also in many ways very hopeful times for climate change action. It's 160 days since 195 countries came to consensus, perhaps partly through exhaustion, in Paris. On December 12th. 177 of those countries signed it at a signing ceremony in Washington, DC in 22nd of April. And if and when it comes into force, it establishes or is based around nationally determined contributions for countries starting in 2020. And those contributions are around mitigation, adaptation, and critically, certainly a big focus of today, finance. Well, there's the challenge of meeting these NDCs, as they're termed, and that's significant. They are ambitious, but it's also estimated that they might only get us half the way, so to keeping warming less than 2 degrees C. So there's work ahead, and then even more. So we do need to get started, and it is, by most estimates, $1 trillion question, and perhaps even $1 trillion a year question. So we sort of have to raise $1 trillion a year, and there's the finance challenge, and then we have to spend it. Not only spend it, but spend it wisely, and that's our investment challenge. With challenge, of course, comes opportunity, and we recently saw from the United Nations Environment Programme, along with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, an estimate of around $290 billion spent last year on renewable energy. The clean energy space is obviously larger than that. And very interestingly, with the developing countries now picking up the majority of that expenditure. Now, look, we have a very busy morning ahead. If you've looked at the program, you will have seen it's probably a day's forum, but we thought when we were organising it, we'd all like the afternoon off. So we're going to have to move along. The program has time for discussion. You will have opportunities to ask questions from the floor and make very short statements if that is your choice. But we're really trying to build the day around opportunities for discussion, given the folks we have here in the room and also speaking. Just some very simple logistics. You exit down there in an orderly fashion, should you need to. The toilets are downstairs, and some of this event will be videoed, not all of it. So just to let you know. There's 4 panels, and our first is here and will be introduced formally in a moment, and that's on international commitments in clean energy investment, Paris and beyond, and we have the United States, Canada and Australian perspectives. The second is on accelerating early stage investment in clean technology, improving our options for that $1 trillion of spending, and we have US and Australian perspectives in that. After we've recovered morning tea, the third panel's on energy productivity, the often neglected part of clean energy finance and investment, and then the final panel's on renewable energy. So, before we go there though, and start off the first panel, I would like to welcome Professor Merlin Crossley, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Education at UNSW. He's also a Professor in Molecular Biology. His bio details are all on the tables there for you, but I should say he did come to us via the universities of Melbourne, Oxford, Harvard and Sydney, and then he arrived and stayed here. So, could you please join me in welcoming Merlin, who's going to then welcome you. So.
Thank you very much, Iain, and I'm delighted to be here. So ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure to formally welcome you to this very important event that is jointly hosted by my university, UNSW, and the US Consulate-General. It is wonderful to have people of such authority on all the panels here today, and to see so many distinguished and engaged people, our leaders and future leaders here in the audience. I warmly welcome you all and do so acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Bedegal people of the Eora Nation, their elders past and present, and I pay my respects to Indigenous people who may be here today. Now I want to begin my welcome with a story about an important international agreement centred around Paris. But I'll start with the accord that was made about 3,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, when Paris of Troy, who was the most handsome man on the planet, ran away with Helen of Troy, the wife of Menelaus. I'm sure you've heard this story. Helen was the most beautiful woman in Greece, and the leaders of all the different Greek nations had foreseen the possibility that she would be carried away. So they had joined together in a very strong pact. They had sworn that if she was carried away, they would all work together and they would move heaven and earth to bring her back to her rightful home. Helen was the face that launched 1,000 ships that were all run on renewable energy. Now, some 30 centuries later, we have something even more beautiful to protect: the planet itself. Another Paris Accord has been hammered out, and the countries represented here today, the United States, Canada, and Australia, have all played significant roles and have formed what some refer to as a high-ambition coalition. The leaders of all three countries have spoken out about the importance of climate change, and we are bound by an international agreement. The agreement is not based on the mumblings of oracles, but on the prophecies of science itself. UNSW is very proud to host the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence in Climate System Science. We work together with researchers across the world, many of them in the US and Canada, to measure climatic parameters and make predictions that are turning out to be alarmingly accurate. In terms of solutions, we believe that energy transitions are possible and that our sophisticated social and political systems will equip us to effect genuine change. The world has been smoking for long enough. It is time to kick this habit. It will not be easy. Few changes are easy. But we are determined that our academics will work together with people from government, business, and the community to explore the best way forward. One component of UNSW's 2025 strategy is to devote ourselves to the grand challenges facing humanity, and the first challenge we identified was climate change. We've had a number of events via forum at UNSW, and the Vice-Chancellor is leading a forum on energy transition that was initiated by the Australian Conservation Foundation, and many of our staff and our students are exploring the best way for us to move away from reliance on carbon-intense technologies. We are no longer reliant on Bronze Age technologies to make a difference. We have the most remarkable technologies available. In the School of Photovoltaic and Renewable Energy Engineering, our staff are working on the world's most efficient solar cells, and others are dedicated to developing batteries for storage, and staff in the Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets help us to understand how to make this all work within a modern economy. We need to communicate about these things. We need multiple disciplines, multiple countries, and people from academia, business, and the communities and governments to work together. I'm very pleased to see you all here. I hope you will enjoy the meeting and will be able to make constructive criticisms. I'll be here for the first session, but be gentle with me because, as Iain said, I'm just a molecular biologist, though I do have an interest in climate science and, of course, in epic poetry. I'll now hand over to others. You'll soon be hearing from our co-host, the US Consulate-General, Hugo Llorens. But first, let me introduce you to our chair for this session, Michael Jensen. He's the recipient of the 2015-16 Australian-American Fulbright Fellowship in Climate Change and Clean Energy, a member of the Regulatory Council of the US Department of Energy Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, of the Steering Committee of a US Business Accelerator Program, and numerous governmental positions in different capacities he's held at the US Department of Energy, at the White House, the US Department of Justice, and the US Environmental Protection Agency. So now it's over to you, Michael Jensen. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Crossley. And I'll be introducing the panel in just a moment. I wanted to give a few brief remarks. First of all, thank all of you for attending and for helping to make this event possible, especially on an expedited time frame. I really appreciate it. Professor Crossley mentioned the Paris Agreement, so I won't dive into that in too much detail, except to say that of the recent Paris Agreement, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, and I quote, "We have entered a new era of global cooperation on one of the most complex issues ever to confront humanity. For the first time, every country in the world has pledged to curb emissions, strengthen resilience, and join in common cause to take common climate action. This is a resounding success for multilateralism." In my mind, the success of the Paris Agreement will be determined by the extent to which multinational cooperation is achieved on increasing investment in climate and clean energy solutions. And against this backdrop, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote panel. First to speak this morning is Hugo Llorens, the Consul-General in Sydney. He is a career diplomat with nearly 35 years' experience and has served in Afghanistan, Honduras, Spain, Argentina, Canada, Bolivia, Paraguay, El Salvador, Honduras, and the Philippines. Second on the dais is Robert McDougall, who is the acting Consul General of Canada in Sydney. After joining the Canadian Foreign Ministry in 1973, he is now the longest-serving officer in what was recently renamed Global Affairs Canada, having been assigned to 17 foreign posts, including stints as ambassador in Serbia and high commissioner in Bangladesh. In Ottawa, he was director for international economic policy and later the longtime director for arms control and disarmament. Finally, Dougal McInnes has worked in climate change policy and business for over 10 years, including for the UN, energy companies, and in the Australian government. He's the acting assistant secretary of the climate change branch at DFAT and was a member of the COP21 negotiating team in Paris. So without further ado, Consul General Llorens.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Iain. It's wonderful to see in Michael another Fulbright scholar doing such great work. And as he's done here, I think but he's off to the Great Barrier Reef soon, by the way. So it's good on you. I would like to recognize Deputy Vice-Chancellor Professor Merlin Crossley and his colleagues from the University of New South Wales for all their important research. UNSW is a world-class institution, and it is advancing the frontiers of knowledge in so many fields. UNSW and other Australian universities are renowned for their incredible leadership and cutting-edge research on renewable energy, particularly in solar and photovoltaics. I just saw the reports this week that 2 UNSW researchers have invented the world's most efficient sunlight to electricity converter module. So congratulations, UNSW. As prominent members of Australia's research and scientific community, you are playing a significant role in the development and adoption of technology that is rapidly changing the world. Your research is contributing to keeping Australia at the cutting edge of innovation, which is crucial for your country to remain one of the most productive and dynamic in the world. This gathering of so many different people from the private sector, from the research community, from the financial community, is really a very valuable forum for discussing global opportunities in the field of energy. As you all know, a major legacy of President Obama's administration will be his historic leadership on climate change and the promotion of clean energy. He has reaffirmed America's commitment to leading the global effort to combat climate change at the successful COP21 climate talks in Paris, underscoring that the United States of America not only recognizes our role in creating this problem, we embrace our responsibility to do something about it. President Obama recognizes the future with an all-of-the-above energy strategy as a path to sustainable growth. And this strategy includes reforming domestic electricity production, unlocking investment capital, supporting research, and transforming transportation and defense policies. He has made clear that over the last 7 years, we've made ambitious investments in clean energy and ambitious reductions in our carbon emissions. The advances we've made have helped drive our economic output to all-time highs and drive our carbon pollution to its lowest levels in nearly 2 decades. A remarkable development, and one that proves that economic growth and lowering carbon pollution are not incompatible. So let me assure you that the United States is keen on strengthening our partnership with Australia on energy. It is an area of tremendous potential benefit for both our countries. Indeed, my goal today is to speak about a trend that has already begun to significantly impact each one of us, and I'm referring to the clean energy revolution. The global renewable energy industry is moving society into a clean energy revolution. Most of us could not have imagined 20 years ago how profoundly the internet revolution would ultimately change our lives. The way we gather information, schedule travel, make purchases, even the way we communicate has fundamentally changed as a result. Well, much like the internet revolution and the industrial revolution, the clean energy revolution is beginning to change the way we live our lives day in and day out. It is changing the way we interact with the environment, the way we build our homes and offices, the way we transport ourselves, the goods and products we consume, the way we heat, cool, and light our homes and workplaces, the way we power our factories and businesses, and many other facets of our lives that we're just beginning to understand. The clean energy revolution represents a tremendous opportunity for our businesses and entrepreneurs. It is good for our national security and will also represent an important part of our collective solution to global climate change. I am happy to say that some of the world's leaders of this clean energy revolution are Americans and Australians. And there are also many US and Australian companies involved, including firms like General Electric, Longevity, Tesla Motors, Solar Reserve, and Vast Solar. And speaking of balance sheets and bottom lines, this clean energy revolution is providing many exciting opportunities for many new businesses in both our countries. As described in the fascinating classic book, The Clean Tech Revolution, the development of clean technologies is no longer a social issue championed by environmentalists. In the past decade, global capital markets and nimble money in the private sector have voted with their wallets by investing tens of billions of dollars in clean technology projects. For example, global investment in renewable energy has grown sevenfold from US $40 billion in 2004 to US $285.9 billion, the highest ever this past year in 2015. Last year, Bill Gates confirmed that he has already invested about $1 billion in early stage renewable energy technologies. He plans to double that investment in the next 5 years and target the next wave of breakthroughs in battery storage and air carbon capture. Late last year, in the lead up to COP21, Gates called together Mark Zuckerberg, Richard Branson, Jack Ma, and George Soros to launch the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which will commit even more funding for transformative energy technologies. This leadership from Bill Gates underlines the importance and business sense to fund research into new technologies. And again, let me underscore the number of positive elements to the current equation. One is the sharply reduced cost of photovoltaic systems that you're contributing to developing right here in Australia. For example, late last year, Texas utility Austin Energy signed a 25-year PPA with SunEdison for 150 megawatt solar power at just below 5 cents a kilowatt hour. The power will come from 2 West Texas solar facilities, which are pricing energy on par with any oil-based fuel. The result of declining PV prices is that installed PV output has jumped 48 times in the past decade and reached record levels of 56 gigawatts in 2015, up from 45 gigawatts in 2014. And that is just incredible output. And I'd like to underscore the broader point that in the last 50 years, composite renewable energy costs pricing have declined 50% every 5 years. And that's an amazing record of achievement. Frankly, this should come as no surprise, since renewables are a 21st century technology-driven model, and as the technology improves and productivity increases, its price will tend to decline. By contrast, hydrocarbons, which are finite commodities, are cyclically based, and their prices are unstable and subject to the vagaries of supply and demand. Indeed, a second positive aspect has been the relative rebound in clean energy share prices. This has stimulated traditional equity investment and hopefully will encourage more future investment by venture capital firms. In the US alone, the venture capital investments in clean technology in 2014, which is when I have the data, totaled $5 billion and represented 20% of total VC financing activity in the United States. A third positive and remarkable aspect is that renewable energy now makes up the largest source of new global capacity. Renewable energy sources, including biomass, geothermal, solar, and wind, together provided for the first time more than half, 53.6%, or 118 gigawatts of new global electrical generation brought into service in the year 2015. That is a revolutionary figure. And as the technology of clean energy continues to advance and mature, so will the positive impact of clean energy investments on corporate balance sheets. Simply stated, opportunities for the private sector in the development of clean renewable energy are immense and will ultimately be the main drivers in guaranteeing energy supplies, contributing to global geopolitical security, and dealing with the problem of climate change. Let me point out one big misconception that we hear a lot daily in the media, the issue of subsidies for renewable energy. The reality is that the lion's share of energy subsidies is in fact going to the hydrocarbons industry. A recent IMF working paper estimates that hydrocarbon subsidies to be a startling US $5.3 trillion, or 6% of world GDP. Granted, part of these subsidies come in the form of setting energy taxes below levels that reflect the environmental and health damages associated with these types of energy consumption. Those are, however, real costs borne by our citizens, and by contrast, renewable energy subsidies worldwide amount to a relatively modest $120 billion. These direct subsidies would vanish if fossil fuels were fairly priced. Clearly, we need to look at the whole issue of energy subsidies in a smart, balanced, and holistic way. In my view, the fundamental long-term market drivers for clean energy remain largely intact. The sharp rise in the world's population exceeding 7 billion people, coupled with the expansion in emerging economies and the rise of hundreds of millions into the middle classes, make it an imperative for businesses in the US, Australia, and around the world to demonstrate resiliency and drive innovation to deliver plentiful and affordable energy. On the geopolitical side, energy security is a key issue for all of us. In the past half-century, the United States became overly dependent on energy from unstable countries and regions. It is dangerous for our militaries, our businesses, and our economies to depend excessively on unreliable and unstable sources of supply and upon commodities with dramatically fluctuating prices. So when the U.S. Department of Defense announced sweeping changes to its energy policy across its diverse branches, it was for one simple reason: operational effectiveness. For example, the U.S. Department of Navy is looking at ways to reduce its consumption of energy, decrease its reliance on foreign sources of oil, and significantly increase its use of alternative energy. U.S. Navy Secretary Mabus announced the Great Green Fleet Initiative, which examines the use of biofuels to power ships. Not only would this decrease the Navy's carbon footprint, it would be less dependent on shocks in the global oil market. While this is a long-term initiative, Queensland Premier Palaszczuk met with senior U.S. Navy officials during her trip to Washington in June 2015 to explore ways we may be able to partner on the Great Green Fleet. I'm pleased to say that Premier Palaszczuk will be following up on these discussions with the U.S. Navy on her upcoming trip to the United States in the coming weeks. Let me go back to the business side. Let me stress that increasingly lower prices for clean tech goods and services are helping wind and solar power in my country begin to reach cost parity in both utility scale and distributed markets. And this is despite the drop in oil prices. Current projections are for non-hydro renewable energy investment to account for 60% of all global power capacity in the coming decade. That and the fact that the stock of hydrocarbon power plants and equipment is older means that most of the capacity that will be retired over the coming decade will be hydrocarbons-based, resulting in a very, very sharp increase in the overall share of energy output generated by clean sources. Biofuels is another exciting field for which there's so much in this country, and developments are moving in a revolutionary direction. Certainly Boeing's and Honeywell's support for breakthrough research on halophytes, a type of plant species that provides superb biomass and grows in desert, salty, and marginal land, is a potential major breakthrough. Researchers are making exciting progress here in Australia and the United States, specifically North Carolina State University, to break down plant cell walls, reduce the amount of lignin, and thereby increase biomass production. I salute the visionary work being done here in Australia and in California on creating more efficient marine algae biofuels production. Let me also mention that in an increasingly competitive business landscape, some of the best run and most efficient companies in the world are turning to clean energy to stay ahead. From large corporations such as Walmart, Amazon, Apple, and Costco, to small local companies, U.S. businesses are making significant investments in solar and wind to cut energy costs, reduce energy price instability, and gain a competitive advantage. For example, last year, technology leader Amazon announced plans to build a 208 megawatt wind farm in North Carolina to power its U.S. East region cloud computing operations. Amazon expects that the site will ultimately generate about 670,000 megawatt hours annually. The windmills will be built and operated by Iberdrola Renewables, a Spanish company, and Amazon hopes to use clean energy to power 40% of its global infrastructure by the end of this year and achieve 100% renewable energy usage for the long term. Similarly, Apple is committed to powering all of its corporate, retail, and data center facilities with 100% renewable energy. Late last year, Apple's 130 megawatt solar facility in Monterey County, California, is scheduled to come online. Partnering with First Solar, the same partner AGL used for its Ningham plant right here in Australia, Apple is investing $850 million. Apple's Monterey solar facility will generate enough power to power its new Apple Campus 2, all its other California offices, all 52 retail stores in California, and its data center in Newark, California. In fact, since 2012, all Apple data centers have been running on 100% renewable energy. That means that whenever you use Siri, buy something at the App Store, get directions on maps, make a FaceTime call, send an iMessage, or store a photo in the cloud, the back-end servers create zero green gas emissions. Speaking of an issue that is of fundamental importance to all of us, is the ongoing revolution in the transport sector. For example, within the past 10 years, hybrid fuel and electric vehicles have moved from the auto shows to the mainstream of personal transportation, with more than 50 models available from major auto manufacturers. In fact, from virtually zero production 10 years ago, the global automotive industry has produced 8 million hybrid vehicles, with Toyota being the global leader and the U.S. being the largest market with 3 million hybrids in U.S. roads. In terms of pure electric vehicles, production is booming, up 73.3% last year from 750,000 vehicles to 1.3 million. As you know, California-based Tesla is a leader in electric vehicles. What is remarkable is that Tesla has passed Toyota as the biggest automotive industry employer in California, with a full-time labor force of 6,000 versus Toyota's 5,300. And Tesla continues to expand its manufacturing capacity in the state of Nevada, creating hundreds of new jobs. What's more exciting is that China reportedly passed its goal to have 500,000 electric vehicles on the road in March of this year. The broader estimate is that hybrid and electric cars will account for 40% of all vehicles produced worldwide by the year 2025, and that's only 9 years away. Some of the most exciting advances in the clean energy revolution are in the area of energy efficiency. This is important because energy saved is energy that does not need to be generated. For example, Bank of America adopted a $20 billion environmental initiative to build energy-efficient buildings. This initiative requires that all Bank of America's new office buildings and financial centers be built with the highest energy efficiency methods. One of the biggest companies in the world, Walmart, has also recognized the incredible value of energy efficiency improvements. You can imagine how much energy is required to fuel a company with over $500 billion in retail sales annually. Last year, Walmart achieved its ambitious plans to double the fuel efficiency of its truck fleet between the year 2005 and 2015 and reduce the amount of energy used in its stores by 30%. Walmart has a long-term goal of powering all of its operations with clean energy. LED lighting is another example. While the benefits of LED lights have long been known, the cost per bulb has been prohibitively expensive. Despite the fact that energy savings and the reduction of replacement costs result in long-term savings, the startup costs were generally deemed too high by the average consumer. In 2009, a 100 lumen LED bulb cost about $50, while in 2014, a 170 lumen bulb was available for $8.41. As such, there will be no possible cost justification for continuing to rely on incandescent or fluorescent bulbs. Globally, LED lighting could account for 80% of the lighting market by the year 2020, saving global consumers tens of billions of dollars annually. As many of you know, there are a number of disruptive technologies that could completely alter the planet's energy equation. Certainly one to watch is the science, engineering, and policy of electricity integration, which will allow the efficient incorporation of renewable and non-renewable sources of power. Another is the creation of new battery technology that uses cheaper and safer materials to store larger amounts of energy. This technology will enable utility companies to use more renewable power, according to Technology Review. One new device is a type of flow battery, which uses liquid materials that rely on iron-chromium chemical reactions to store energy. As you all know, Tesla has unveiled a home battery product, which people can use to store from their solar panels or to backstop their homes against blackouts. For homeowners, the Tesla Powerwall produces either 10 kilowatt hours or 7 kilowatt hours at a cost of $3,500 or $3,000. Tesla has said it will be producing larger batteries for business and utility companies, listing projects with Texas-based Encore and Southern California Edison. Again, these technologies, once developed, are going to be game changers, and the market makers are beginning to take notice. Barclays, the British banking giant, in the year 2014 downgraded the electricity generating sector of the U.S. high-grade corporate bond market in its entirety because of the emergence of cost-competitive substitutes that Barclays has determined will completely disrupt the status quo of the utility model. Conclusion, there is some room for healthy debates and honest differences. I hope, however, that you agree that one thing is clear, that technology and market trends are making renewable energy a staple of powering our economies. And this trend will grow dramatically over time. Most important, I believe, if you stop, think, and look around you, you'll agree we're in the very eye of an irreversible storm transforming our lives, and that is the clean energy revolution. I'm also convinced that the dynamic research, scientific, policy, business, and environmental community representatives here at this conference and across Australia are contributing and will continue to contribute to hastening this revolution. My staff and I look forward to working with the revolutionaries in this room and forging closer level cooperation that is necessary between government, business, and the research community. Again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Consul-General Llorens. Consul-General McDougall.
So, bonjour, good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to present Canada's voice at this Clean Energy Forum, and I wish to thank our hosts, Professor Crossley and Dr. MacGill. It is always difficult to follow someone who is both passionate and well-informed, as is the Consul-General from the United States, but I will do my best, bearing in mind, however, that it is before 10:30, and although my body is here, my brain is still asleep. For those of you who are following the Canadian news, Fort McMurray is still burning weeks after the wildfire started there. It would be overly simplistic, of course, to blame that solely on climate change, but there is no doubt that the climate is changing all around the world and that such change is already causing problems. I was in the Maldives, accredited to the Maldives, and I visited them once, and the president proudly showed me the highest point in the country, which is 2.7 meters above sea level. He was a bit worried about sea level rise. In Bangladesh, I was briefed on the fact that if the sea level rose as little as 1 meter, 20% of the country would be underwater. It's a very low country as well. These are not small things. Habitats are changing, endangering wildlife, causing them to migrate north and south, spreading plant, animal, and human diseases. It may soon be possible to get malaria in places that had never heard of the disease before. Water sources and arable land are under grave threat in many places, leading to potential catastrophes for agriculture and human habitation. Increased pressure on human societies are predicted to lead to strong pressures to migrate, even security-related conflicts, certainly contributing to areas of tension. These are only a few symptoms of the catastrophic situation that we face here and now. We're not talking about futurology. We're talking about things that have already started to happen. Much of the problems clearly result from human intervention in the carbon cycle, and we are finally beginning to do something about it. We can only hope over time to mitigate the worst effects, eventually start to reverse them, and meanwhile adapt to the inevitable. Now, that's a pretty gloomy forecast, but we are, as I said, starting to do something about them, the problems here. One of the positive avenues being explored in this regard is the subject of the meeting today, clean technology, engaging the ingenuity of our best scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs in bringing us out of the fix in which we have landed ourselves. Like more established sectors of the economy, clean technology is increasingly playing a part in how we are reimagining the way society will work, because it will be a fundamental change, not just tinkering at the margins. At the same time, it is a technological and economic force that will create new systems to redefine how the world works too. But we've been there before. Transformative technologies aren't just invented and then immediately rolled out to change the world in a blink. They lead to the evolution of new worldviews and economic organizations, and that takes time and work. So when we're thinking clean technology, we have to think about it in a broad context. For example, take the internal combustion engine, the transition from invention to ubiquitous use. The foundations included not just the cars themselves and the trucks, but a system of laws to govern who could drive and how. It meant building and maintaining a system of better roads, traffic lights, gas stations. It meant creating businesses that employed people to make, distribute, and maintain the cars. And financial institutions were involved to finance all this commercial activity and later to develop ways to help would-be car owners actually pay for their purchases. In many ways, this is where we are today on clean technology, at the beginning of an unimaginable change in the way we interact with the world and in the way we interact with each other. Now, at the Paris Climate Conference in December, as was said, 195 countries adopted the first ever universal, legally binding global climate deal. As our new Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, declared on that occasion, the world gathered in Paris to fight climate change and its devastating impacts on our Earth, our health, our economy, and our very way of life. We also gathered with a common vision to leave a sustainable planet for our children and grandchildren. The Prime Minister admitted that much work still needed to be done in Canada and around the world to implement the agreement in response to one of the greatest challenges of our generation. Canada is making climate change a top priority. We will support and implement policies that contribute to a low-carbon economy and will include carbon pricing and national emissions reduction targets as part of our strategies. The First Ministers of the Canadian provinces and territories have met with the Prime Minister to work on a plan to meet our international commitments in tackling climate change and transitioning to a low-carbon economy. Canada's provinces have in fact taken a leadership role in Canada with regard to climate change, as I will discuss later. A pan-Canadian climate change framework is being developed to assist with our implementation of the Paris Agreement. The government intends to move towards a climate-resilient economy and invest in public transit, green infrastructure, and clean technologies to create new jobs and support communities. Policy options will be informed by the best economic and scientific evidence. These options include carbon pricing, support for energy efficiency, clean electricity and transport, and sustainable buildings and infrastructure. Adaptation will be a clear focus of our efforts. And the plan will be flexible to circumstances and policy approaches, from cap and trade to a ban on coal-fired electricity generation, from world-leading innovation on carbon capture and storage to a revenue-neutral carbon tax. All will be considered in terms of policy approaches for the provinces and the country. We will also, of course, emphasize innovation. We will also take a new leadership role internationally. Among other bilateral and multilateral opportunities, we will participate in collaborative initiatives such as Mission Innovation and the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Mission Innovation is worth exploring a little further. It's a global partnership aimed at doubling government investment in clean energy innovation over 5 years, while encouraging private sector leadership in clean energy. This initiative of, I believe, 17 countries seeks to coordinate better and report on clean energy efforts. In addition, over 20 private sector investors have agreed to provide support for the development of clean energy technologies in participating countries through what is called the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. Through Mission Innovation, Canada will work with global partners to promote cleaner energy and better environment outcomes that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Australia, the US, and Canada are 3 of the Mission Innovation partner countries represented by speakers on this panel, and I expect Mission Innovation will be a useful forum for closer information sharing and cooperation among us. In this context, we believe that climate finance is critical. Canada's commitment of $2.65 billion over 5 years will help developing countries reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change as well. These efforts can bring about transformative change through increasing access to energy and poverty alleviation. The agreement also mandates a prominent role for the private sector and multilateral institutions to mobilize finance. Those who can act must do so. Collectively, we are already rising to the task, with more than 160 countries representing over 90% of global emissions having committed to take action under the Paris Agreement. This is unprecedented and about time. But let's drill down, if I can use that phrase in an environmental setting, and look at what's happening on clean tech in Canada. As part of Canada's efforts to promote a clean environment and strong economy, we are committed to investing an additional $100 million each year in clean technology producers and tackling Canada's most pressing environmental challenges. The government will also invest an additional $200 million each year to support innovation and the use of clean technologies, specifically in the natural resources sector, something which I know is also of interest here in Australia. Clean energy research and development will be one of those areas of focus. In that context, I can notice that clean tech is already becoming a major sector of the Canadian industrial economy. In 2014, as in your case, Professor, the latest time we have data for, clean industry revenue was already estimated at $11 billion annually and employed 50 to 60,000 Canadians. 80% of the companies in that industry were exporters, generating revenues of approximately $6 or $7 billion. Overall, companies in the clean tech industry in Canada spent over $1.2 billion in R&D in 2014 and $7.6 billion cumulatively from 2008 to that year. And this is not merely an R&D matter. 80% of the industry's companies are at the product commercialization stage or higher in the chain. The way government deals with clean tech is going to be important. I mean, it will be important to make the right balance between promoting but also enabling. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're doing is going to have to be done by the private sector, by NGOs, by academics. I mean, the government is not in a position to do it all, nor does it believe it has all the answers. So so we've been doing and paying attention to surveys of what others are doing. In a recent survey conducted by Analytica, for example, Canadian clean tech firms cited changes to carbon regulations as having the most positive potential impact for their activities. The three most desired regulatory changes were a carbon tax, carbon emissions credits, and/or a carbon cap and trade scheme. And that's from industry. They say that is what would help them most in developing their approaches. In a comparison of clean tech ecosystems across the globe, these surveys also indicated that Canada was currently perceived as one of the top countries in terms of favorable regulations, but of course not without certain reservations. A wide range of comments and viewpoints have been expressed by stakeholders during the consultative forums. And some of the points that they told us, or told the survey companies, Canada is seen to have effective innovation policies and programs that have produced the results in the form of commercially proven technology. That's the good side. That said, it's also perceived that a lot more work is needed to translate these proven technologies into broader environmental and economic benefits, and that's something that the government needs to focus on, so we are told. Such a thrust could also help ensure that Canadian clean tech innovation companies have an increasingly attractive environment in which to scale up. I mean, it's finding the solution is only the first part of the answer. You've also got to make it commercially feasible, or nobody's, you're going to get resistance to buying it. In this context, modernized regulatory policies in selective industries based on performance standards are suggested to help encourage the uptake of climate-friendly innovations. So it's not only encouraging the companies that can produce the technology, it's also making it easy and attractive for people to buy them and make use of them. There are also calls for policy to enable greater access by innovators to public procurement as a pathway to their participation in high-visibility projects, including green infrastructure. Some respondents have further suggested that public investments in clean tech innovation should target areas where Canada has strong commercialization capacity and where global commercialization opportunities are evident. Meanwhile, across the country, the clean tech sector is recognized as a key driver of innovation, and a range of specific policies and investments are in various stages of exploration and implementation. As I mentioned before, a lot of this is happening at the provincial level because in our system, natural resources and energy and a number of other factors are in fact provincial rather than federal responsibilities. But for example, in 2015, the province of Alberta implemented three major steps: new climate regulations, including an economy-wide carbon tax, starting at $20 a ton and raising to 30 by 2018. Regulations to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is, of course, a very big part of Alberta's economy, by 45% over 10 years. And a cap on oil sands emissions based on 3 million barrels per day, up from the current 2.5 million barrels a day. So these are major steps, and they will have a strong knock-on effect on our clean tech industry. Meanwhile, the province of Ontario, our biggest province, announced a $325 million, what they called a down payment, on its pending cap and trade program market revenues for projects that fight climate change while growing the economy and creating jobs under the Ontario Green Investment Fund. But let me get back to something I raised again earlier, the importance we attach to the question of finance, clean tech finance, because all this is going to cost money. I mean, it will save money, it will save the environment, but up front it will cost money. So conversations are occurring across Canada on this subject. As the clean tech industry takes on bigger turnkey projects and as firms move into full-scale commercialization, they will find themselves constrained, so they tell us, again, this is what we hear from the industry, significantly by lack of debt financing, which remains the top listed barrier for Canadian clean tech firms. Understanding how capital markets could form around securitization of intangible assets and with backstopping of risk taken by both buyers and sellers of clean innovation is a question being explored actively by the industry at the moment. The clean tech industry in Canada has also highlighted the value of coordinating the formation of capital markets with the formation of carbon markets. How do you integrate the government policy changes with the necessary financial changes? Government-sponsored green bonds, for example, have been proposed by industry stakeholders as a means of financing environmentally friendly projects. And an increasing number of financial institutions are catalyzing change by requiring public disclosure of climate risks on corporate balance sheets. Finally, innovations are also being proposed in international climate finance, for example, enabling regional development banks to guarantee power purchase agreements by utilities in developing countries. This is another thing that's being supported both by us and by appropriate sectors of our industry. I'm almost there. In summary, the world is still under serious threat from climate change, but we are beginning to focus more urgently on how to resolve the problems. Many different approaches are being tried, as is the logical methodology. One of these approaches is clean technology, which is being advanced by a wide range of global actors. For example, global governance entities advocate policy changes that would lead to the restructuring of traditional energy markets. Governmental and intergovernmental policies, with input from academic and other non-governmental experts, such as those gathered here, are clearly reshaping global energy regimes and markets with far greater encouragement for clean technologies. The private sector, backed by scientists and engineers, is a driving force behind generating and commercializing new approaches to clean tech. And with the commitment to reducing global emissions and increasing uncertainty over the exploitability and economic viability of traditional energy reserves, global investors are looking for new targets with long-term potential, including emerging clean tech opportunities. So clean tech is an important element in a great enterprise that engages the people of the whole world. In closing, I'd go back to Professor Crossley's remarks about Paris and Paris. In looking at the older Paris, I was interested in his discussion of the generation of the decision to go to war, which was, I hope the men in the audience will excuse me for saying, is a classic male patriarchal approach, where a bunch of men got together and decided to do something about an insult to their honor. I've often wondered, I mean, I have read the Iliad, I've often wondered whether anybody actually ever consulted Helen. I mean, did she want to be rescued? Maybe she was in love with Paris. I mean, I don't know. But the fact is that nobody ever asked. I think this augurs, our current Paris augurs a little bit better because, in fact, he has been widely consulted. I mean, it's taken us a while. Kyoto and everything was only a half success. But I think what is different here is the fact that people have been consulted, people are engaged. It's not just the governments, it's also all of us, and all of us are getting concerned about it. And that's important because it's a big problem and it'll only be solved by our joint efforts. With a little bit of luck, we will wind up doing better than creating another Trojan War, which would be a bad precedent. So let's leave it there. But to end on a serious note, this is something that we have to get right. It is a problem. It's not a problem for the future. It's a problem that's already happening. Clean tech is a good way to look at it, not the only way, but a good way to look at it. But we have to get this right. Our children and their descendants will live with our success or failure. So we have to get it right. Thank you.
Acting Assistant Secretary McInnes.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you to the University of New South Wales and to the US Consul-General for putting on this event. Not only am I eating into your morning tea time, but Australia is also, as you well know, in caretaker. So I'll shy away from talking about any domestic policies here, other than to say that the polls for registration close on Monday, so make sure that you've registered so that you can cast your vote in July. But what I'm going to do is talk about four things. The INDCs that were mentioned at the very start and what they mean for clean energy, the role of private sector finance, Thirdly, just a comment on what I call adaptation finance and the importance of adaptation finance to clean energy. Fourthly, on mainstreaming and the role that mainstreaming is playing in the climate debate. And then just lastly, a few brief remarks on Australia. But I'll be quick because I think, as Iain said at the start, discussion is the focus of the day. So INDCs, these targets for post-2020, they were set in Paris. It's a bottom-up process, so countries own them rather than them being set from the UN. Essentially, they're not just targets. Our analysis is that the key emitters, the major emitters in our region, have all, in their INDCs, have quantified renewable energy commitments. So in a sense, those plans, those commitments that will be annexed to the Paris Agreement are the forcing function for a huge amount of clean energy investment in the region. The challenge now is to take these pieces of paper and turn them from commitments and contributions to business plans and investment plans. And by doing that, actually making sure that they connect to the private sector. And I was in the US recently, and the new US climate envoy made the remark, half serious, but I think it has got a serious point. He said that actually we should look at those INDCs, 190 of them, and get graduate students to transform them into business plans. You know, look at these things which have been set by governments and see what can be done to connect them to the real world so that they can be implemented. And I think for Australia, that's a key role for DFAT and for the Australian government going forward, is making sure that we provide the capacity and the capability for countries in our region to turn those plans into real action. The second point to make is on the role of private sector finance. There's a $100 billion goal to 2020. To 2025, under the negotiations, there's going to be another long-term goal. And if you ask some countries, that's going to be in the order of 5 to 6 times 100 billion, by mid next decade. But the point is that we need to shift the billions and indeed the trillions of climate finance, and that requires the private sector. And what that means is that it's not a question of too little capital out there. There's enough capital out there. It's about having bankable projects, and bankable projects that ensure government understand the language of Wall Street. I was in the US week before last talking to a range of US banks and finance houses, and a lot of them made the same points. They said that government need to better understand how they operate. They need to understand what a risk-adjusted return is. They need to understand the role that concessional finance can play, the role that you can structure debt, as our Canadian colleague said, that the role that backstopping, the government can play in backstopping risk. And by ensuring that what has become to date, up to this point, a policy-driven, government-driven sector, by transforming that into a private sector role, government can actually work with the private sector. So public and private partnerships in that sense are key. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of this work is happening, so it's not about reinventing structures and creating new things. It's about actually using what we already have, the IFC, a lot of the MDBs and the multilateral development banks, a lot of the private sector finance groups out there, BlackRock and others, are doing this. But it's about actually finding that patient capital that needs that longer term. Those longer-term returns, and actually working with government for that. And I think for us, that is really around looking at what's happening already out there and taking that to the next step. And that's the role that we're really focused on at the moment. And that requires a balance between getting runs on the board now, because we need to show post-Paris that we're taking steps, but also about working for those longer-term settings, the enabling environments that are required in some of these countries that have poor capacity, to actually put in place some of these longer-term settings to ensure that the projects and the finance is sustainable. And I think what we also need in the private sector discussion is specificity. We need to get down to the level of projects, to the sectors that the projects are in, to having those discussions about the numbers behind the commitments and working at a level of specificity that we actually haven't got to yet. And that will require government to both educate themselves on how this works, but also to engage at the project level and the private sector firm level to make sure that these projects happen and get the runs on the board. As I said, the third area is just on adaptation finance, and I think there's a really important role here for adaptation finance. It's a hard nut to crack. Everyone talks about clean energy finance because we understand what it means. It's about infrastructure and building things. Adaptation finance is actually about finding finance solutions that actually reduce the impacts of climate change over time. And we already see this happening in a sense, that there are wind farms out there that have forecast returns that are lower than what they forecast because the wind speeds are less because of El Nino, and El Nino is exacerbated by climate change. And the tragedy, the irony of the tragedy is that actually you could create the low emissions world out there, but then it's destroyed by climate change. So actually understanding the role that adaptation needs to play when we build the clean energy finance wind turbines and solar units is really important. And I think it provides a whole nother set of actors, an avenue into the private sector space that we haven't actually dealt with yet. The last point is just on mainstreaming. There's a really important point about what Paris has done is actually bring climate change into the mainstream, perhaps belatedly, but it is in the mainstream. And what that requires is that governments now need to think about climate change across the economy in development settings, in the aid spend, in central economic planning, in all that they do. And I think the US AID and the US government are leading on this, so is the UK government. Talking to the White House recently, they have their climate advisor sits directly outside the Oval Office. And President Obama has said that all climate change spend will be screened in their development spending. Australia is looking at a similar model. I know the UK government is taking similar steps. But what it really requires is for us to look at how we spend our money and not just have these silos, but actually make sure climate crosses all of those. The last point is just on Australia and some remarks on what we're doing. I think the challenge for government is firstly one of coordination and making sure that the plethora of organisations out there that we're involved in are used efficiently to get outcomes that we've heard about this morning. You know, there are so many organisations in the clean energy space, from APEC to the International Energy Agency to Mission Innovation, which Australia is a member of, to the Green Climate Fund, IRENA. In domestically for Australia, there's the CFC and ARENA. So there's many acronyms out there. But the point is actually making sure that they work domestically, they're coordinated, they work internationally with international forums that are driving this, like the G20, and that they use those political moments that Paris was, that the G20 summit in September in China will be, that the next COP in Marrakesh in November will be, and that there's essentially greater coordination. And that's a task for government, but it's also a task for the private sector to understand how to use government for that coordination. I think I'll leave my remarks there, because I think the point of this morning is also to hear from yourselves and to get some discussion. And so thanks very much again to the university and to the Consul-General for putting this event on. Thanks.
Any questions from attendees? So there, I believe, will be a few mics going around. If any of you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and jump up. Okay, well, to get the juices flowing, perhaps I'll ask one or two questions, and feel free to queue in line as well. Consul-General McDougall, you mentioned earlier that government isn't in a position to increase investment alone in clean technology, and the three of you mentioned the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, businesses large and small that are investing in clean energy, climate finance initiatives. Given that recent estimates have indicated that we need to scale up energy efficiency and renewable energy from approximately 280 to 300 billion to about $1 trillion of investment each year, I'm wondering how you would describe the role of government in scaling up clean energy solutions and the relationship between the government and industry and what the responsibilities of each are.
Well, it's a combination of factors. I mean, as I pointed out, we are pledging to put in some of the government's money into these over the next 5 years. I mean, I'm sure beyond as well. We've already pledged hundreds of millions of dollars in government funding for this kind of thing. But in the final analysis, a lot of the investment is going to have to come from the private sector investors, just as a lot of the actual technology is going to be developed by commercial firms or commercial firms in association with science and engineering facilities of various kinds. What the government can do, and this applies to much more broadly than just clean tech, what the government can do is at least make it easier and more profitable for the non-governmental sector to do that work. And this includes, regulatory changes, and also coordinating regulatory changes with, the investment requirements. There's changes in the way the financial sector is treated in terms of clean tech, ways in which R&D can be directed. So I think it's a combination of using some of the government's money, some of the government's regulatory powers, and job owning, frankly, and also just making it easier and more profitable for people to develop, not only develop, but also to commercialize and buy clean tech. It's a balance. I mean, the governments certainly can't do it alone, and wouldn't have all the bright ideas, frankly, to do it alone. But on the other hand, they can be helpful, and they can provide seed money here and there to help the early stages of the process.
Do you have any comments?
I'd just say that I think it's actually that the government has a tricky role. If you look at the McKinsey cost curve, at one end there is some safe bets on clean energy, which is relatively risk-free. At the other end, you have the harder things that are more expensive and have greater risk. The question is, where does government put its effort and its resources and its money, and what decision does it make? To take the Iliad example, the point of that was that they made a decision and they went with it, and it was a firm decision that they stuck to and delivered. I mean, I think it requires some thought around: do you put it into the PV space, or is that at market parity and therefore that can run without any government support, or do you put it into concentrated PV, concentrated solar, CCUS, some of the things at the other end of the curve? I think that's a really big decision for governments needing to make both domestically and together internationally.
The only, I would mention that very much along the lines of what Rob said, that in the U.S. a lot of the a good policy work that has been done has been at the state level. So what you have is different states promoting different sets of incentives for the private sector, and so in many ways, kind of the states have driven the development. A great example would be when I've mentioned a lot about, obviously, President Obama has put in a set of policy settings that no doubt have been very friendly to the clean energy industry. And you just look at the numbers in terms of U.S. investment and output in the sector, lending by the banking community. But also, this trend started, in the Bush administration. There was a lot done during the Bush administration. So I would argue that you had two presidents who sort of got it. And again, President Bush was someone who sort of came from an oil background, so he would be the last guy you think would be on board. But actually, when he was governor of Texas, he put in place one of the most forward-leaning policy regimes in the promotion of wind energy. And no surprise today, Texas is by far America's largest wind producer. So again, I just think that, obviously the federal governments play a very big role, but I think that a lot of the creative stuff happens at the state level, same at the provincial level.
Do you have any other questions for our keynote?
Thank you. Neil Raffin from Centre of Energy and Environmental Markets here. There was a theme of the need for coordination amongst the various climate initiatives discussed by the panel. And Dougal, I was wondering if you could take a step further and talk about actually how do we implement that coordination. I note the Australian Energy White Paper process, for example, isn't really, arguably not taken that seriously by stakeholders. And perhaps the other panellists could comment on initiatives in their jurisdictions. Thank you.
I think there's domestic coordination and there's international. On the international side, one of the best forums where we're focusing on how to get that coordination is the Major Economies Forum. Again, to take a leaf out of Hugh's recent example, the Major Economies Forum was set up by George W. Bush as a way to get discussion on climate change outside of the UN negotiations. So it's the 16 or 17 largest economies in the world. And under that group, there's also a climate finance donor group that meets, which is essentially the industrialised, developed countries of that grouping. And so what we're doing under that donor grouping is we're looking at a series of working groups that can actually start on that question, because it's amazing how many people in government wear similar hats but don't make those connections. And I think as I said in my talk, the G20 this year is a really useful discussion to have that, because the Chinas have put climate change on the agenda, and I think it's a way to say, well, what are we doing on climate finance in the G20 working groups? What are we doing in the UN in this, and how can the MEF play that role in helping that collaboration? On the domestic side, the good thing we did as Australia last year in setting our 2030 target was the huge amount of consultation with stakeholders, with NGOs, with civil society, and we also had a task force that was across government. So we actually have a really good sense of who the main players are outside of government, and there's a lot of work going on in making sure that there is some streamlining of that effort, and I think post-election we'll see some evidence of that.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think in terms of the Canadian domestic side, we've also had quite extensive consultations. One of the key ones, which is the Federal Provincial Conference on the Environment and Climate Change and its successor meetings and bodies, because a lot of what we have to do is a matter of coordination between the federal and the provincial level. One commonality, I think, that is a positive one between the international and the domestic consideration of these issues, and I think it was the key to the success of Paris was that you don't assume one size fits all. You create consensus on the broad goals and outlines, but then you let the individual participants come up with their own ways of reaching those goals, rather than trying to create a unified global policy, or in the case of Canada, a unified national policy. I mean, the national policy is we've got to do something about the carbon balance, and clean tech is a good thing. I mean, there's sort of high-level agreement on those by at least all of the governments and most of the population. But what Paris didn't do internationally, and what we haven't done in Canada, is say, all the provinces have to take the same approach. The same approach to carbon taxes, the same approach to clean tech. We get together, we agree that this is the goal, and then we say, okay, now, how can we help you to sort things out the way you think works best? As long as progress is being made towards the goals, it's up to you what works best in your area.
Okay, with that, I'll have to cut the conversation short as we're running a bit over time. Please join me in thanking our three keynote panelists.